Hey Geek, so let's talk about firmware updates, specifically Sony camera firmware updates, but also this can affect you regardless of what camera that you do decide to buy if you don't already have one. And when it comes to the whole world of Sony, I have a little bit of experience with it. So the very first camera that I had was this one right here. This is the Sony CyberShot camera. This is how I created my first YouTube videos. And then now I actually have a real camera, in this case, the Sony A7IV full frame hybrid camera. This is an awesome camera. I love it. I have very few, if any, complaints in using this camera. But now we have some updates to some other Sony cameras, and well, it's kind of got me a little bit salty. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. And so the cameras that I'm talking about here are the Sony FX3 and the Sony FX30. So the FX line is part of their cinema line, and the FX3 is basically a Sony A7S III, just built more for cinema. And the FX30 is the less expensive APS-C version of this camera. They are great cameras, and they just recently got some new firmware updates, and they're pretty big updates. And so if we look here, we see that the update was provided on 4/11/2023, and they do provide a variety of big updates, especially for people who own this camera, which is always a good thing. And at least in my opinion, if you are going to be providing a firmware update, make sure it's actually good. And now let's go ahead and contrast this with my camera, the Sony A7 IV, but other cameras as well. And so the Sony A7 IV, it did get an update about a month ago on 3/9/2023, so in March. And so that's very recent, but the update is basically just replacing your app to control your camera from your phone. So this is now the Creators app versus the Image Edge mobile app that they were using previously. And then for even more expensive cameras, the Sony A7S III last had an update on September 14, 2022. And that one was basically just a stability of the camera update. And then finally, the flagship Sony camera, the Sony A1, last had an update on the same date. It also has the stability update, but also eye autofocus as well. And so if you're looking at this, what's the big deal? Why am I making this video? Why do I have this mini rant? Well, the simple thing is these are not cheap. So at least for me, this is a lot of money. I had to invest in this. So the camera body alone for the Sony A7 IV is currently $2,500. With the lens and everything else that I purchased for this to actually get it to work is around $3,000. And later I bought this other accessory, but let's just say around $3,000 for this. And then the Sony A7S III, even now the body is $3,500, and you add lens and accessories, it's going to be around $5,000. And the Sony A1 flagship is probably going to cost you a lot overall, but the body itself, I think the last time I looked, it was around $6,500. So if you add lens, accessories, and so forth, it's probably going to be around the $8,000 mark. And the thing is, these more expensive cameras, these especially the flagship cameras, they're not getting these huge, big updates. And then when you consider new cameras that Sony has released with the Sony ZV-1, it actually has more features software-wise than these more expensive camera models. And that's why I kind of got to talk about this, because if you're thinking about getting your first real camera, besides looking at the actual camera itself, the ecosystem, all the features that it has that actually suit your needs, you also think about other things like support, and the Sony A7 IV, this is not an old camera. And my feeling is, very similar to the Sony A7S III or the Sony A1, it might get less and less updates in the future. And the updates that they do get are going to be more maintenance versus getting a lot of these great features of their newer cameras, even though hardware-wise, most of these cameras, especially these flagship ones, should be able to handle a lot of these. And I understand that technology is constantly moving, and you can't necessarily expect firmware updates for really old hardware. But in this case, we're not talking about 10, 15 years difference. And once again, if you're spending thousands of dollars on these flagship or expensive cameras, then I would expect them to get most of these features, if not all of them, if possible, because obviously you are spending and investing a lot of money. And so that is my thoughts on that today. If you are considering getting a camera, definitely look at the overall support, the track record, the firmware updates that a company has. And I have a Panasonic Lumix G85, and as far as I've seen, they are really awesome when it comes to providing firmware updates way longer than a year or two. And so if you actually had any thoughts on this, be sure to leave it in the comments area below. And if you did want to see more of my camera tips, tutorials, thoughts, I do have an entire playlist. I'll leave in the description area below or up here. For serious YouTubers, check out TubeBuddy, the premier tool news at geekoutdoors.com. Get more done today by checking out the affiliate link in the description area below.